Good evening. This week we're going to be talking about arguments, not arguments in the sense of a fight or a dispute, but argument as a process of reasoning from evidence to conclusions. Understood in this way, arguments are everywhere. You find them in academic essays and political cartoons, in advertisements. Argument is involved in working out plans for action and choosing between alternatives. And we'll be talking about that too. We're going to be learning about the parts of an argument and how they fit together, how to find the arguments in texts and put them in standard argument form. There's a whole thing called complex arguments, and just like last time, I'm going to be showing you how to apply all of this by working through an example. I should tell you that this material normally takes me about 3 or 4 hours, minus inflation, to get through in a regular lecture, but it looks like it's going to come out as two videos of roughly half an hour each, maybe a little bit less, maybe a little bit more. Probably one of them will be like a little under half an hour and the other one will be a bit over half an hour. I'm not sure. I'm still shooting them. I'm able to do this because of editing, but this means that there's going to be a higher than normal density of information. So I encourage you to take full advantage of the medium of video lectures and pause, skip, rewind, like and subscribe, all of that stuff. Let's get started.
As I was saying, people write texts for all sorts of different reasons. People write texts in order to express their feelings. Some texts are written in order to explain. Scientific or academic texts are sometimes like that. Texts can be written to entertain. This would include both fiction and nonfiction. Texts can be written to illustrate, and texts can also be written in order to persuade someone of something. So we're going to be focusing on that last one, texts that attempt to persuade people through argument, or what we sometimes call reasoning. Reasoning is not the only way to persuade people. You can persuade by means of a threat, give me your wallet or I'll shoot you. You could try to persuade by means of a bribe. If you stop crying, I'll give you a cookie. You could try to persuade by means of emotional manipulation. If you really loved me, you'd have sex with me. None of those are reasoning. They're forms of persuasion, but they're not forms of argument. It's an argument when you have a position and you support that position with reasons. So you're trying to persuade somebody, but specifically you're trying to persuade them by giving them reasons to believe, not by threatening them, not by emotionally manipulating them, and so on. When that sort of thing, you'll sometimes come across emotional manipulation and such in arguments, but when you do, we call those fallacies, and we'll be talking about those in a future week. Different kinds of text can present arguments. We're going to be mostly focusing on arguments in the written form because that's mostly what you're going to be running into in university. And part of what I'm supposed to be doing in this course is helping you with your other courses. However, we are going to be looking at arguments in other forms, different kinds of texts, such as posters, cartoons, etc. An argument is a claim supported by one or more reasons. So in order to have an argument, you need to have a position that you're trying to prove, but you need to have more than just a position that you're trying to prove. You also need to have at least one reason in favor of that position. There are different words that we can use for the parts of an argument. The part that you're trying to prove can be called the thesis, conclusion, or position. A claim is just asserting something to be true. It's like a declarative sentence. It's sunny outside today. I like chocolate chip cookies. These are claims. They're all claims. The name for the part of the argument that you're trying to prove, I'm going to be calling it a conclusion sometimes. It's also called a thesis or position. The name for the parts of the argument where you that you use to support the conclusion are called reasons or premises. And I'm probably going to be going back and forth freely between those two different terms, reasons and premises. Please note, sometimes people use the word premise differently. They will speak of the premise of someone's argument when what they should be saying is the conclusion or the thesis. It's incorrect to describe what somebody is arguing for as the premise. So this is how reasoning works. What you want to do is you want to persuade somebody, which means take them to the place where they don't believe something to a place where they do believe it. So the claim that you're trying to prove should be something that whoever you're addressing doesn't already believe. And you take them there by making claims that they do already believe. So ideally, your premises should be things that your audience believes are true or will accept as true. And the conclusion or the thesis ideally should be something that they don't already think is true. Your job is to persuade them. So like I said before, every time you make a claim and support it with a reason, you're engaging in an argument. This can happen when you're trying to persuade people. It can also happen, though, when you're trying to, so to speak, persuade yourself, which is to say, when you're trying to make a decision. If you're trying to decide what university to go to, and you're considering the reasons for this one and the reasons for that one, while you're engaging in a form of argument, or at least a form of reasoning. So when you're deciding what toothpaste to buy, if you're looking at the reasons for the different options, then that's argument. If you're deciding what university to go to and you're looking at the reasons, you're engaging in argument. If you're deciding whether or not to get married by looking at the reasons, then you're engaged in argument. And speaking of that, some of you may have heard of Charles Darwin. He's the evolution guy. When Charles Darwin was considering getting married to his cousin, what he did was he made a list of reasons for and against. And what you see here on the screen, if I'm doing things correctly, this is a photo from his actual notebook of his reasons for and his reasons against. I think these are reasons for and these are reasons against, but I can't read this. Who can read this? Not me. Here's a text of some of the reasons. This isn't even a transcription of the text. This is like all paraphrases. So here's some reasons to get married, in Darwin's opinion. Children. Children is a reason to get married. Constant companion. Someone to take care of the house. The charms of music and female chit-chat. Object to be beloved and played with. I'm not sure what that means. Sounds a little sketchy to me. Better than a dog. Okay, you heard it from Charles Darwin, everybody. A wife is better than a dog. Darwin says so. Reasons not to marry. Freedom. Not forced to visit relatives. Well, who likes to visit relatives? I don't even like to visit my own relatives, let alone other people's relatives. Conversations with clever men at clubs. Okay, I think, yeah. So I think, yeah, what he means is if he gets married, he doesn't get to have conversations with clever men at clubs. Anxiety and responsibility. I think he means if he gets married, he'll have to face anxiety and responsibility. Less money for books, etc. So I just think this is an amusing example of somebody engaging in reasoning in real life. He like really did this. Oh, and here's a transcription of the actual text, which I'm obviously not going to go through, but it's here in case you want to look at it. So in case you're wondering, he did decide to marry his cousin.
You were wondering about that, weren't you? They had a long and happy marriage with 10 children and surprisingly few birth defects.
There's something called an enthymeme. The enthymeme is a helpful way of approaching the concept of argument because it reflects this structure or form that you normally encounter arguments in everyday life. And it also can act as a skeleton that can be fleshed out. That's what you do with a skeleton. You put flesh on it in order to understand arguments in more depth. Also, enthymeme is fun to say. So here's an example of an enthymeme. Oh, look. Here's an example of a Siamese cat. Her name is Mia. Why anybody would choose to look at me when they could look at Mia instead, I have no idea. Anyway, the enthymeme. You should wear a face mask in public because it will help slow the spread of COVID-19. Well, I'm sure you've heard this, and this is an enthymeme, which means it is also an argument, an incomplete argument, but nevertheless an argument. Gesundheit, Mia. Mia has allergies. I think it's too dusty here. I've decided that it's going to be easier to move out of the apartment than to clean. Okay, so what is the claim being made here? In other words, what is the argument trying to prove? Or what is the author of the argument trying to prove? Anybody?
The author's trying to say that if you wear a face mask, then it'll help you like not get corona. Like you can avoid catching COVID from it.
Well, that's more of a paraphrase or a summary of the whole thing, and I'm more interested in looking at the parts of it. The part that the argument is trying to prove or convince you of is that you should wear a face mask in public. So there's two parts here. One of the parts is what it's trying to prove, you should wear a face mask, and the second part is the reason for that, which is wearing a face mask in public will help slow the spread of COVID-19. So those are the two parts. You can see both of them there. I rephrased the second part, the part after the because, just for clarity. I mean, if I had written, it will help slow the spread of COVID-19, that might have been slightly confusing in case you didn't know what the it referred to. But as you can see, it's just a touched up version of what's already there in the text. It's this part. So normally the reason will come after the because. There's not always going to be a because.
But there will often be an equivalent word, such as since or as, and we'll be looking at a list of those in a bit.
So there is a part missing from this argument. In order for your reason, wearing a face mask in public will help slow the spread of COVID-19. To persuade your reader to wear a face mask, one other thing has to be true, and that thing hasn't been stated. So what else needs to be true in order for this to be convincing to your reader or your audience?
Oh, sorry.
But you can go ahead.
I was saying it's assuming that slowing the spread of COVID-19 is a good thing, that's something we should want to do.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly what I was looking for. It assumes that slowing the spread of COVID-19 is a good thing or it's something that we ought to do. This is a piece of background information, or you could think of it as a shared assumption. You could also think of it as a shared value. But as you know, not everyone shares the same assumptions and values. Some people don't care about spreading COVID-19. So that's why it's important to identify the unsaid part of the argument, because if you don't identify it, then you're not going to know whether or not you agree with it. So when you're given an argument in the enthymeme form, you have to ask yourself what's missing, and then please write it down so that it can be made explicit. If it's not explicit, you won't be able to tell whether you accept it or whether there's something wrong with it, whether there's any funny business going on.
Alternate universe, Jay, jumping in here with a clarification. The way I unpacked the example of an enthymeme might make it look like, actually, the word enthymeme refers to any argument which has implicit or implied premises, whatever specific form that argument takes in terms of, its appearance or sentence structure. You might hear me saying the word warrant. Well, warrant is a sort of technical name for an implicit or implied premise. An implicit or implied premise isn't just any bit of information that is missing from the argument. It is actually a missing premise that is implied in the sense that it needs to be there for the argument to work logically. What I've been calling the warrant in the COVID-19 argument bridges or connects the premise that's already there with the conclusion. And that's why the reader can be expected to fill it in for themselves. If, on the other hand, we believe that the assumption is unwarranted, meaning unacceptable or unjustified, then there's a problem with the argument. And that's why, when analyzing arguments, we need to write it down instead of leaving it to float between the lines.
Now, because a warrant is an unstated part of the argument, that means that you're going to have to supply it yourself, which means you're going to have to put it in your own words. When you do that, it's good to, as much as you can, stick to the words, the terms, and the phrasing that you're given. That's in the thesis and the reason. But I want to be clear that there's not going to be any one right answer here. Here are some different examples of different ways that we could have phrased the warrant, the part that we have to fill in. We all have a duty to help stop the spread of COVID-19. We need to stop the spread of COVID-19. Stopping the spread of COVID-19 is the right thing to do. Luckily, you're almost never going to run into arguments that don't have a context. And the context will almost always make it easier both to interpret the information that's there and to fill in any missing parts. I have here a list of words that usually are found with reasons or premises. Normally they precede reasons or premises. Because is sort of your standard one, but there's plenty of equivalents. Since, for the reason that, and all of these end in ... because they precede the part of the argument that is a reason or a premise. Now note that although in the enthymeme it gives you a thesis and a reason, obviously arguments can have more than one reason. In support of them, often they have many reasons. One of the cats was peeing, and she just looks so dignified when she does it, standing up straight. Okay, anyway, here there are also words that you can use when you're trying to figure out what is the thesis, what the person is trying to prove. If somebody says, it's raining outside, therefore you should bring an umbrella, well, the therefore part precedes the thesis or the conclusion. And there's a lot of equivalent words. Thus means the same thing as therefore, consequently also means the same thing. So these words will normally precede statements that are conclusions, meaning whatever claim is being supported. Now, there won't always be a because or therefore. You can't always count on these words being present to tell you when you're faced with a thesis and when you're faced with a reason, but they can help you out. If a text is well written, then what is the thesis and what is the reason or reasons should be pretty obvious whether or not they use one of these indicator words. In the case that it isn't obvious, we're going to be looking at lots of cases of those, and practice should help you.
Now I want to talk about something called standard argument form. Texts that contain arguments, essays, op-eds, political cartoons, are not normally written in a way that is optimal for logical analysis, unfortunately. You see, there's something called genres. You're probably familiar with the word genre from fiction or movies. Science fiction is a genre, mystery is a genre, romance is a genre. Well, there are genres for nonfiction writing too. And these genres come with certain expectations, certain aesthetic requirements that they have to meet. One of these expectations is that they be, as much as possible, pleasant and easy to read. Obviously, an op-ed like the one that we looked at last week isn't going to be as much fun to read as, say, a Spider-Man comic or a Terry Pratchett novel. There will definitely be fewer jokes, but those are the constraints of genre. It is an op-ed, and it is normally, probably, it is generally written in a way that is easy and pleasant to read by the standards of an op-ed. Texts, you see, are meant to be read. And if you want someone to read your text, you want your text to, well, sound good. You've probably been given this sort of advice with your own writing. You want to use a variety of words. You don't want your sentences to sound repetitive. Ideally, you'd like there to be a rhythm and a flow. And if the kind of text that you're making presents an argument, you want it to be persuasive. But the thing is, you can't persuade someone using your text if no one reads your text. And that's why the criterion of readability is sometimes prioritized over logical considerations. Let's call them logical considerations. As we saw with the Andre, I'm going to say Andre, with the Andre Maru gun control op-ed last week, texts can be written in a way that sounds persuasive when the actual arguments, in terms of their content, aren't actually persuasive. Text can be written in a way that they can hide things. Imagine you're buying a house. The real estate listing has lots of pictures and it looks great. But you're not going to buy the house without going to the house and looking at it yourself, are you? Why not? You know why not. You know that the images on the listing are constructed carefully to make the house seem as appealing as possible. They aren't going to show you the mold in the basement or tell you that there's a strip club across the street. Do strip clubs still exist? I feel like they probably don't, but you get the idea. Just like an ad that's constructed to sell you a house, a text is constructed to sell you an argument. So standard argument form, or I'm just going to say standard form, is a way to lay out an argument as clearly as possible so that you can see all of its parts and how they fit together. This allows you to evaluate it objectively rather than perhaps as the author would prefer you to evaluate it. It is particularly useful for arguments with a lot of premises and a complex structure. But we are going to start with something simple. Let's go back to the COVID example. Oh, wow, it's already here on the screen. Isn't that lucky? What does it say? You should wear a face mask in public because it will help slow the spread of COVID-19. You remember from our discussion earlier that this is an enthymeme, meaning that it is missing a premise. And we did a whole thing where we found that, and here it is. So what we did was, because it was an NT meme, it had an implied or implicit premise, and we added it, which required us to write it. Anyway, here it is. It says the assumption. What you see here is not standard form, but including implied premises, or what here is called an assumption, is part of putting arguments into standard form. Why? Because the purpose of standard form is, like I said a moment ago, to lay out all of the pieces of the argument so that you can see how they fit together. So you need to have all of the pieces, including the pieces which are not stated. They're implied. You have to read between the lines, but I'll say the same thing that I said before. You can't add just any information, and implied premise, like the warrant here, is one that is required for the logic of the argument to work. Basically, it connects the premise with the conclusion, or as it says here, the reason with the thesis. Wearing a face mask in public will help stop the spread of COVID-19. You should help stop the spread of COVID-19. Therefore, you should wear a face mask in public. Notably, what's going on here is that the reason wearing a face mask in public will help stop the spread doesn't contain the word or the concept should. The thesis tells you what you should do. The reason doesn't say anything about should. It's just like a piece of objective information. There's a whole thing which we will talk about interminably, where you're not supposed, where logicians say that you can't infer a should statement from a not should state. You can't infer a statement that says how things are to a statement that says how things should be. That is why an implied premise needs to be filled in here. Or to put that another way, that is why there is an implied premise here, because the thesis, we know the thesis says you should wear a face mask in public because that was already there in the original text of the argument. Here, I'll show you. There, see? You should wear a face mask in public because it will help slow the spread of COVID-19. So we said that. Let's review a little bit. So we said that you should wear a face mask is the conclusion. It's the thing that's being argued for. And we said that the other part was the premise, and we knew it was the premise because it contains one of those lovely indicator words. In fact, the most common indicator word, because. Because almost what comes after because almost always is going to be a premise. But wait, our conclusion says what you should do. Our premise just says what is. It states like a fact, almost like an objective fact, almost a scientific fact. Maybe it is a scientific fact. Anyway, doesn't matter. Also, by the way, at this stage of putting arguments in standard form, we're not really worried about whether or not the premises are true or have other problems. We want to just make sure that we know what the author is trying to say. Only after we know what the author is trying to say do we evaluate it. Otherwise, we could end up making a mess of the author's argument because we're judging before we have all of the information. There you go. The conclusion says you should do something. The premise doesn't say should. And in order to get to the conclusion, we need to add a premise which says should, and we did that in the simplest possible way, which is what you're supposed to do. So yay, good for us. That part ended up being a lot longer than in my notes. Putting an argument in standard form involves taking each one of its claims and running it out as a full statement in a single sentence on its own line, like this. Wearing a face mask in public will help stop the spread of COVID-19. You should help stop the spread of COVID-19. Therefore, you should wear a face mask in public. Premises go on top, conclusion on the bottom, with a line in between them. Yes, there is a cat. Let's pretend it's not there. So why do we represent, why is standard form done in this particular way? Well, ignoring the cat was not a good strategy. She almost sat on the computer and ruined everything. She almost sat on the lecture self-destruct button. So what, wait, what? Look at this. Look, I have a blank screen. How do I have a blank screen? I'm not kidding about the cat. She can do these things where she can accidentally make things happen on my laptop. I don't even know how to make them happen. There's like all of these hotkeys that she can magically find because she's a cat. And I don't even know how to find them. Here, I'm going to delete this now. Anyway, you were asking, why put it in this particular form? Well, it's just the way that we do it. Why do we drive on the right side of the road? Well, the answer is it doesn't actually matter which side of the road we drive on, but it is very important that we conform to the same rules. It's very important that we all agree to drive on the right side of the road, if you see what I mean. So the purpose of a formal structure like this is to allow us to see at a glance how the argument fits together without having to figure it out. So this is the way that we've decided to do it. It's fine. So for consistency's sake, to make sure that we are all on the same page, we're going to do it this way. Now, what you see here, what you see here is, did she just knock over a glass? Why are you like this? So what you see here is the most basic version. So I'm using a variety of texts in this course, and some of them will be showing you arguments in standard form, and some of them will look like this. Some of them will not look like this. There are slight variations. This is how I prefer to do it. This one, see? I changed the slide. I would forgive you if you didn't notice, because the cat is very distracting. What you see now is another way to do it, and this is the way that I prefer. So you're probably going to be seeing most of my examples written in this form. So as you can see, I have added letters and numbers. P is for premise, and C is for for conclusion. We number them so that we can easily reference them later. So for example, if I need to refer to the first one, I don't have to say, hey, the premise that says wearing a face mask in public will help stop the spread of COVID-19. I can just say P1. It's very convenient. This also allows us to represent the structure of the argument without having to write out the actual sentences, as you can see here. You can also do it in a different way. See? So this one here, this is just obviously the same as the other one, with the premises on top of the line and conclusion underneath it. I hope this is easy to follow. It's quite simple. So if it is somehow not easy to follow, that is my fault, or possibly the cat's fault. Anyway, you can see it drawn in a different way over here. P1 plus P2, and then an arrow going to C3. Why is there an arrow? Arrow in this symbology represents inference. The arrow is the direction of inference. So P1 and P2 lead us to C3. The premises lead us to the conclusion, in a logical sense. Being able to represent it with letters and numbers is useful if we want to represent arguments with complex structures, like this one. Yes, so this is an argument with a complex structure. I don't really want to take the time to explain it to you, because we're we're not really, this is called an argument diagram, by the way. We're not doing argument diagrams today. I'm just doing this to show you why it's useful to use the letters and numbers convention. So there. I'm not being defensive, you're being defensive. Standard form often means that we have to paraphrase premises. Why? Well, because we want them to be as clear and specific as possible. Earlier, when we were unpacking the nth meme, which is still fun to say, we changed it will help slow the spread of COVID-19 to wearing a face mask will help spread the slow of COVID-19. Yes, that's absolutely what I meant to say. And we did that because it, what does it refer to? We wanted to make it as clear as possible. Now, you remember how when people in high school or elsewhere giving you tips on how to write, they say things like, don't use the same word over and over if you need to refer to the same thing. Try to vary your language. So instead of saying COVID-19 every time, you could say the coronavirus or just COVID, because that is more pleasing to the ear. It's less monotonous. Well, forget about that. When we're doing standard form, we want to use the same words as much as we can so that the connections between the claims are as clear as possible. I think I did a kind of a good example of that when I was talking about should earlier. Likewise, premise 1 says COVID-19, premise 2 says COVID-19. If premise 2 said the coronavirus, you could infer that it meant the same thing, but you shouldn't have to infer. You want to make it as clear as possible. I understand that it probably doesn't seem like it matters with this example, but this example is like the simplest possible example. It will matter for other examples. Trust me, I have done this before. When we're doing standard form, we want to use the same words as much as possible because that shows how the premises fit together. And we also want to use simple declarative sentences. What you get, unlike the original text, is something that can be quite monotonous to read, but logic is not meant to be fun. It's meant to be pain. It's like learning French. So paraphrasing can get a bit more involved than just replacing this or it, but we are going to be practicing putting an argument in standard form on a not as basic as possible case like this one. So I'm going to save that for then, which will be later in this lecture or in the second half of this lecture after the break, where I split it into two parts. In fact, I think I'm going to do that now. Split